Welcome to the channel, my alien friends. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Enjoy listening. The hum of the transport shuttle thrummed through the metal frame as it pierced the thick atmosphere of Valuria, descending towards the planet's surface. Riley sat by the small circular window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared down at the alien world below. The landscape was unlike anything he had ever seen. Vast forests of towering trees, their leaves shimmering with soft, crystalline light. Rivers wound through the valleys like veins of molten silver, reflecting the faint glow of Valuria's twin suns hanging low in the sky. It was beautiful, almost surreal, but it did nothing to quell the knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. This would be his new home, for the next year at least, as part of the Intergalactic Coexistence Program, a diplomatic initiative designed to foster relationships between Earth and Valuria. Officially, his mission was simple: learn from the Valurians, understand their culture, and represent Earth in a world far different from his own. But the abstract concepts of cultural exchange and diplomacy seemed distant now as the shuttle began its final approach. Riley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, adjusting the stiff military-style jacket that felt out of place here, among the flowing robes and natural fabrics the Valurians favored. He had been preparing for this moment for months, studying their customs, memorizing their language. But now, as he peered out at the capital city, Zyra, his preparation felt inadequate. The Valurians were known for their unique abilities, the capacity to sense and even project emotions with a depth humans could barely comprehend. To them, feelings weren't just abstract experiences. They were tangible, almost palpable forces that shaped their interactions and decisions. Emotional honesty wasn't a choice, but a necessity, and that's what unnerved Riley the most. On Earth, he could control his expressions, hide his fears or doubts behind a stoic mask, but here, among the Valurians, there would be no hiding. A soft jolt shook him from his thoughts as the shuttle touched down. The hiss of the door opening filled the small cabin, and the warm, fragrant air of Valuria rushed in, carrying with it the sweet, earthy scent of the alien world. Riley gathered his things, slinging a small bag over his shoulder, and stepped out onto the landing platform. The Valurian capital city, Zyra, stretched out before him. The buildings, smooth, curving structures that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape, rose up from the earth like living organisms. Their glass-like surfaces shimmered under the twin suns, reflecting the lush greenery of the surrounding forests. Everything about the city felt organic, as though it had grown from the planet itself rather than been built upon it. As Riley descended the ramp, he was greeted by a Valurian guide, a tall, graceful figure with iridescent blue skin and large dark eyes that seemed to radiate calm. The Valurians, even in their casual movements, possessed an almost ethereal grace that made Riley feel clumsy by comparison. "Welcome, Riley," the guide said, his voice melodic and soft. "I am Tevra, your guide to Zyra. We've been expecting you." Riley managed to nod, trying to muster a smile. "Thank you. It's beautiful here." Tevra smiled knowingly, as if sensing the mix of awe and anxiety bubbling beneath Riley's surface. "It is, but Valuria is more than what you see. It is what you feel." As they made their way through the city, Riley couldn't help but marvel at how seamlessly the Valurians had integrated their architecture with the natural world. Towering trees wound their roots around the bases of buildings, while crystalline streams flowed between them. Valurians moved gracefully through the streets, their long limbs and shimmering skin giving them an otherworldly appearance. Every now and then, Riley felt the weight of their gaze, a lingering, curious glance that made him feel exposed. "They sense your unease," Tevra said, his voice breaking the silence. "Do not worry. They are merely curious. Emotions here are felt more openly." Riley nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow, though it wasn't the heat that made him uncomfortable. He had always been a private person, guarded even. The thought of living among beings who could sense every flicker of his emotions was unnerving in ways he hadn't anticipated. They arrived at a rounded, sleek structure nestled within a grove of glowing trees. "This is where you'll be staying," Tevra said, gesturing to the building. "Your roommate, Zyra, is inside. She is looking forward to meeting you." Riley's chest tightened at the thought. A Valurian roommate, one who could likely sense his nerves the moment he walked through the door. He had known this was part of the arrangement, but the reality of it was different. His roommate was not just a diplomat or fellow exchange participant, but a Valurian who lived and breathed in a world where emotional boundaries barely existed. Taking a deep breath, Riley stepped inside the dwelling. The interior was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and smooth, flowing walls that gave the room a serene, almost liquid feel. But what immediately caught his attention was the figure standing at the far end of the room. Zyra. She was taller than he had imagined, even for a Valurian, with long, slender limbs and skin that glowed faintly in the soft light of the room. Her silver hair, braided intricately, shimmered as she turned to face him. But it was her eyes, large, almond-shaped, and as dark as the night sky, that arrested him. They seemed to see through him, as if she could peer into the very depths of his mind, stripping away the layers of guarded emotions he had spent years perfecting. "Welcome, Riley," Zyra said softly, her voice melodic and soothing. "I hope your journey wasn't too taxing." Riley cleared his throat, suddenly aware of the heat rising to his cheeks. "No, it was fine. The planet is incredible." Zyra smiled, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm glad you think so. Valuria has much to offer, not just in its landscapes, but in its people." As Riley sat on a small, sleek chair, he felt an odd sensation, as if the air in the room was subtly shifting. He glanced at Zyra, whose gaze lingered on him for a moment before she spoke again, her tone gentle but direct. "You're anxious," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Riley blinked, momentarily startled by the accuracy of her observation. Yeah, a little." There was no point in denying it. Zyra's expression softened. "It's understandable. Our worlds are very different. But you will find that we are not so different when it comes to what matters." Her words, coupled with the calm in her voice, soothed Riley more than he expected. There was something about Zyra's presence that put him at ease, despite the unnerving thought that she could sense everything he was feeling. For the first time since landing, Riley allowed himself to breathe. Valuria was different, alien in every way, but there was a strange comfort here, in Zyra's unflinching emotional honesty. And as the evening unfolded, with discussions about customs and routines, he began to realize that this was only the beginning. His time on Valuria and his connection with Zyra would soon challenge everything he thought he understood about emotions, privacy, and connection. Tomorrow, everything would change. Riley awoke to the soft light of Valuria's twin suns filtering through the large window of his room. The warm, golden glow bathed the curved walls, casting shadows that shifted with the gentle sway of the trees outside. For a moment, he lay there, taking in the strange beauty of it all. The delicate hum of the alien atmosphere, the subtle floral scent carried on the breeze, the stillness of this new world. Everything about Valuria was foreign, yet undeniably captivating. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The previous evening had been uneventful on the surface, a calm exchange of information and pleasantries with Zyra. But in the quiet moments, when their conversations lulled, Riley had felt something else. The way Zyra's dark eyes lingered on him, as if she was reading emotions he hadn't even realized he was feeling. He had never been comfortable showing vulnerability, and here he was, living with a being who could sense it all. Every flicker of anxiety, every burst of fear or awkwardness, there was no hiding from Zyra. And yet, she remained serene, her emotions tightly controlled, a calm sea compared to the storm brewing within him. Shaking off the weight of his thoughts, Riley decided to take a shower to clear his mind. The Valurian facilities were different from what he was used to on Earth, but the water, cool and refreshing, helped ease the lingering tension in his muscles. He let the gentle stream wash over him, trying to let go of the anxiety that had been building since his arrival. Stepping out of the shower, his skin still damp and glistening under the warm sunlight, Riley wrapped a towel loosely around his waist. He intended to get dressed immediately, but something about the moment, the peace of the morning, the soft light warming his skin, made him pause. Sitting on the edge of his bed, he let himself breathe, trying to center his thoughts. And then it happened. The door to his room slid open with a soft hiss, and before Riley could react, Zyra stepped into the doorway. Her eyes locked onto him, wide and unblinking. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Riley's pulse quickened, a sharp rush of embarrassment flooding his veins. He was sitting there, half naked, droplets of water still clinging to his skin, the towel barely hanging onto his waist. And Zyra, tall, graceful, composed Zyra, stood frozen, her hand still resting on the doorframe, as if she had forgotten how to move. Riley's mind raced. His first instinct was to cover himself, to hide his body, but in the back of his mind, he realized that this was more than just a moment of physical exposure. In Valurian culture, nudity carried a deeper meaning, a symbol of vulnerability, emotional openness, and trust. This was not just about being seen, it was about being known, about having the very core of oneself laid bare. "Zyra, his voice faltered, unsure of how to address the situation. Zyra's eyes flickered, her normally serene face showing a flash of something Riley hadn't seen before. Surprise, maybe, or something more profound. Her iridescent blue skin seemed to glow faintly, her lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something but couldn't find the words. For a moment, the space between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken emotions. "I didn't mean to intrude," Zyra whispered, her voice softer than usual, almost fragile. Her gaze remained fixed on him, lingering longer than seemed appropriate, as though she were trying to make sense of what had just happened. "It's okay," Riley managed, his heart pounding. "I should have locked the door." But there was something in Zyra's expression that told him this moment wasn't just about the door. The air around her seemed to ripple, a faint shimmer that Riley recognized as a manifestation of Valurian emotional energy. Zyra was feeling something intense, and Riley, still seated on the edge of his bed, could feel it too. Her gaze dropped, and Zyra took a hesitant step back, her cheeks flushed with the faintest hue of violet. Was she blushing? Could Valurians even blush? Riley didn't know, but in that instant, he felt the full weight of the emotional significance of what had just happened. Without another word, Zyra turned and slipped back into the hallway, the door sliding shut behind her, leaving Riley alone, still clutching the towel around his waist. For a long moment, he stared at the door, his mind reeling. It wasn't just the awkwardness of being seen, it was the intensity of Zyra's reaction, the way her emotions had flared up, disrupting the calm she always maintained. And as Riley sat there, heart still racing, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far more significant had just occurred. Something that went beyond simple embarrassment. In Valurian culture, exposure was more than physical. It was a revelation of the self. Riley had been exposed in more ways than one. And from the way Zyra had reacted, it was clear she had been affected too. But what did it mean? Riley wasn't sure, but he had a feeling that this was only the beginning of something much deeper than he could yet understand. The evening air on Valuria was cool, a gentle breeze rustling the glowing leaves outside the window. Inside the dwelling, the soft light from the twin moons filtered through the large curved windows, casting a silvery glow over the smooth walls. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of distant life in the city. Riley sat on a low cushion in the common area, his mind racing in the aftermath of the day's events. Ever since that moment, when Zyra had seen him, truly seen him, something had shifted between them. It wasn't just the accidental intrusion or the awkwardness that followed. There was an unspoken tension now, an undercurrent that neither of them could ignore. Riley had sensed it immediately, and he was certain Zyra had too. Every glance they shared since that moment seemed charged with an intensity that hadn't been there before. Zyra entered the room quietly, her graceful steps almost soundless. Riley tensed as she approached, still unsure of how to interpret what had happened earlier. She had retreated so quickly, her emotions fluctuating in a way that was rare for her species, whose calm and controlled demeanor often left them unreadable. But now, her presence alone seemed to stir something in him, an emotional energy that he didn't quite understand. Zyra sat across from him, her long, delicate fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes, usually serene, were filled with a complexity Riley couldn't place. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken words settling in the air between them. Finally, Zyra broke the silence. "Riley," she began softly, her voice carrying a subtle tremor. "What happened earlier? It was not just a simple mistake." Riley felt his heart skip a beat. Of course, it wasn't simple. Not here, not in Valurian culture. He had learned enough about their ways to understand that emotional exposure meant far more than just physical vulnerability. But what he hadn't anticipated was how deeply it would affect him, or her. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," Riley said, his voice low. "I didn't want to make you uncomfortable." Zyra shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, though her eyes still held that depth of emotion. "It wasn't discomfort," she replied, her gaze steady. "It was something else." Riley swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had felt it too, though he had no idea how to articulate it. His embarrassment had quickly given way to something more, a connection, a spark of energy that pulsed between them, lingering even after the moment had passed. "I felt something," Zyra continued, her voice growing softer. "When I saw you, when we shared that moment, it wasn't just physical. It was like an emotional spark. I don't fully understand it, but I can't ignore it." Riley's chest tightened as her words washed over him. He had been trying to shake off the strangeness of the encounter all day, but hearing Zyra speak about it so openly made it impossible to deny. There had been something there, something that transcended the awkwardness. And now, sitting across from her, he could feel it again, a low hum of emotional energy vibrating between them, almost tangible in the air. I've been feeling it too, Riley admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ever since then, I can't stop thinking about it. About you. Zyra's eyes flickered, a subtle shift in her expression as she registered his words. For a moment, the serene calm that usually enveloped her seemed to waver, and in its place, Riley saw something raw, curiosity, perhaps, or even desire. It was a side of her that he hadn't seen before, and it stirred something deep within him. I've never experienced this with anyone, Zyra said quietly, her gaze locking onto his. Not with another Valurian, and certainly not with a human. Riley felt his pulse quicken. There was a vulnerability in her voice, a hesitation that was foreign to her species, known for their emotional steadiness. But here, in this moment, Zyra was anything but steady. She was open, exposed in a way that went beyond anything Riley had expected. Without thinking, Riley reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he placed it on the table between them. Zyra hesitated for only a fraction of a second before her hand met his, their fingers intertwining. The moment their skin touched, Riley felt a jolt of electricity shoot through him. A sudden rush of warmth and energy, like a spark igniting a flame deep within his chest. Zyra inhaled sharply, her eyes widening as she, too, felt the surge of emotion. The air around them seemed to thrum with an intensity neither of them could explain, as if their emotions had become a living force, swirling between them, wrapping them together in an invisible bond. For the first time since arriving on Valuria, Riley felt completely exposed. Not just physically, but emotionally. And as he gazed into Zyra's eyes, he saw the same vulnerability mirrored in her, the same spark of connection that had ignited between them. I don't know what this means, Riley said, his voice trembling slightly, but I want to find out. With you. Zyra's lips parted, her expression softening as she nodded slowly, her grip tightening around his hand. Together, she whispered, her voice barely audible. In that moment, under the soft glow of Valuria's twin moons, something changed between them. Something profound and unspoken. It wasn't just an emotional spark, it was a bond. And though neither of them could fully understand it yet, they both knew that their connection had been set in motion, pulling them toward a future neither could have anticipated. The next few days passed in a delicate dance of silence and stolen glances. Riley felt the weight of his emotions pressing in on him with each passing hour, his thoughts consumed by the inexplicable bond he shared with Zyra. They hadn't spoken about the spark that had flared between them since that night, but its presence lingered in the air, charged and undeniable. Every time he saw her, he could feel it, a pull, an intensity, something far more profound than attraction. It was as though their very souls had intertwined, even if they hadn't fully acknowledged it. Riley was pacing the common area one evening, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't shake. He had come to Valuria as part of the intergalactic coexistence program. He had a duty, a mission. But the boundaries of that mission had blurred, and his feelings for Zyra had grown into something far deeper than he'd expected. It was a complication he hadn't been prepared for. As he turned the corner of the room, he found Zyra standing near the window, bathed in the soft light of the twin moons. She looked serene, but Riley could sense the emotional tension that hummed beneath her calm exterior. She turned to face him, and their eyes met. Once again, that familiar rush of energy swept through him, as if the connection between them grew stronger every time they were in the same room. I've been meaning to talk to you, Zyra said, her voice softer than usual, almost hesitant. Riley felt his throat tighten. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but he had no idea where it would lead. Yeah, he replied, his voice heavy with the weight of unsaid things. Me too. Zyra took a step closer, her movements as graceful as ever, but her eyes held an intensity that sent a ripple of tension through the air. Riley, we can't ignore what's happening between us, she began, her words careful, deliberate. There's something more than just an emotional connection here, and I need to understand it. We both do. Riley nodded, his heart pounding. I felt it too. It's not just me, is it? Whatever this is, it's real. Zyra let out a soft breath, her dark eyes locking onto his. It's real, she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. And it's dangerous. Riley's pulse quickened. Dangerous? The word felt heavy, laden with implications he hadn't considered. Zyra turned away from him for a moment, her hand resting on the window ledge as she gazed out at the luminous landscape of Valuria. In our culture, she began, emotions aren't just fleeting experiences, they have power. They shape who we are, they guide our lives. And this, what we're feeling, what's between us, it's stronger than I've ever known. She hesitated, her voice dropping lower. It's something my people don't take lightly. Riley's mind raced. He had known that Valurians were deeply connected to their emotions, that their culture revolved around the idea of emotional transparency. But the gravity of Zyra's words sank in like a weight pressing down on his chest. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice thick with uncertainty. "What happens now?" Zyra turned to face him again, and for the first time, Riley saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "It means that if we let this continue, there will be consequences. The Council, they monitor these kinds of bonds. They don't allow emotional entanglements between Valurians and humans to deepen, not without oversight. If they sense what's happening between us, they could force us apart." Riley felt his breath catch. The thought of being torn away from Zyra, of losing this connection, sent a sharp pang through him. "You're saying we could be separated?" Zyra nodded slowly. "Yes, if the Council deems it necessary." Riley's chest tightened. He hadn't realized just how deeply his feelings for Zyra had grown until the thought of losing her became a possibility. The bond they shared was still so new, so fragile, but it had already become a part of him. The idea of having that torn away felt unbearable. "So what do we do?" Riley asked, his voice desperate, pleading. Zyra took a deep breath, stepping closer until she was just inches away from him. Her eyes searched his face, her emotions swirling in the air between them, thick and potent. "We have to decide, Riley. Do we continue this, knowing the risks, or do we pull back before it's too late?" Riley swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts, his duty, his mission, his future back on Earth. But then there was Zyra, standing before him, her emotions laid bare, her vulnerability exposed in a way that mirrored his own. He couldn't ignore the pull, the depth of what was between them. "I can't walk away from this," Riley said finally, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I don't want to pull back. I don't care what the Council thinks or what they might do. I want to see where this leads." Zyra's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Riley nodded, the intensity of his feelings surging to the surface. "I've never been more sure of anything." For a long moment they stood there, the weight of their confession hanging in the air. The bond between them, the spark that had ignited and grown, was undeniable. But now it carried with it the threat of consequences they couldn't fully predict. Zyra reached out, her hand brushing against Riley's, and once again he felt that surge of energy, the spark that had bound them from the start. Whatever came next, they would face it together. But as they stood in the quiet stillness of the night, both of them knew that the real consequences of their bond had yet to unfold, and the decisions they had just made would shape the future in ways neither of them could fully understand. The air inside the council chamber was thick with tension. Riley could feel it pressing down on him, an invisible weight that made every breath feel heavy. The chamber itself was vast, circular, and lined with shimmering columns that seemed to pulse faintly with the emotional energy of the Valurians who stood in silent observation. At the center of it all was the Valurian Council, seated on raised platforms, their gazes fixed intently on him and Zyra. For the first time since arriving on Valuria, Riley truly felt the magnitude of the situation he had found himself in. This was no longer about cultural exchange or diplomacy. This was about him and Zyra, about their bond, a connection that defied the very rules of the intergalactic coexistence program. And now the Council had summoned them, not as participants in a peaceful program, but as subjects of scrutiny. Zyra stood beside him, her usual calm demeanor faltering ever so slightly. He could sense the unease radiating off her, like a ripple in the emotional energy that surrounded them both. She hadn't spoken much since they had been called to appear before the Council, but Riley knew that she was as worried as he was, perhaps even more. The stakes were higher for her. This was her world, her people, and now their connection was under examination. One of the council members, a tall, dignified Valurian with deep blue skin and silver markings along her face, rose from her seat, her voice echoing in the chamber. "Riley of Earth, Zyra of Valuria, you stand before us because the bond you have formed has come to our attention. It is not an ordinary bond, nor is it one we take lightly." Riley's heart pounded in his chest. He had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a wave of fear through him. He glanced at Zyra, who remained still, her gaze fixed on the council member who spoke. "You have created an emotional connection that goes beyond the parameters of the exchange," the council member continued, her voice both stern and measured. "It is a bond that, if allowed to grow, could have consequences, not only for you but for the delicate balance between our worlds." Another council member, a male Valurian with shimmering emerald skin, leaned forward. Our people have always understood the power of emotions, how they guide our actions and shape our futures. This connection between you two, it is not something that can be ignored. The intensity of it is not natural between a human and a Valurian. Riley opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered. What could he say? How could he explain something he didn't fully understand himself? All he knew was that the bond between him and Zyra was real. It was deep, and he couldn't let it go. Zyra, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward. Her voice was calm but laced with an undertone of defiance. Our connection is not something we planned. It wasn't a choice, but it is real, and we have both accepted it, knowing the risks. The lead council member's gaze sharpened, her eyes narrowing slightly. It may be real, but it is also a threat to you, to Riley, and to the program that unites our species. Valurians are bound by their emotions. Once such a connection is formed, it cannot easily be undone. Riley felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He had read about the Valurian bond, how once it took hold, it was nearly impossible to break. But hearing it spoken now, in this context, made it all the more daunting. The council exchanged glances, their silent communication unnerving. Finally, the lead member spoke again, her voice colder now, more formal. We will not force you apart, but the choice must be made. If you wish to remain together, you must undergo the ritual of binding. Riley's breath caught in his throat. He had heard whispers of the ritual, a sacred ceremony that permanently intertwined the emotions, thoughts, and lives of two individuals. It was not something entered into lightly. Once bound, there would be no going back. Their emotions would become one, their fates sealed. What does that mean? Riley asked, his voice trembling slightly. The council member's eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. It means that if you choose this path, you will be bound to Zyra for life. Your emotions will no longer be your own, and the connection you share will grow stronger than you can imagine. It will be a permanent bond, unbreakable, and you will never be able to return to Earth as the man you once were. Riley felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. His life on Earth, his mission, his past, all of it would be left behind. He would no longer be just a human, he would be part of something far more profound, far more permanent. But in that moment, as he glanced at Zyra, he knew the choice was already made. Zyra's eyes met his, and for a fleeting second, all the tension, all the fear, seemed to fade away. What was left was a quiet certainty. The bond they had formed wasn't just a complication, it was a gift. And despite the risks, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Riley couldn't turn away from it. The lead council member's voice cut through the silence. You have until tomorrow to make your decision. If you choose to undergo the ritual, we will prepare. If you choose to separate Riley, you will return to Earth, and the bond will be dissolved. Riley's heart raced. There was no time to waste, no time for second-guessing. The path before him was clear, but the weight of that decision pressed down on him like never before. As the council members stood, their robes shimmering under the pale light of the chamber, Riley and Zyra were left alone in the silence. For a moment, neither spoke, the enormity of the choice hanging between them. Finally, Zyra reached for his hand, her touch sending a familiar warmth through him. Whatever we decide, she whispered, her voice steady but filled with emotion, we decide together. Riley squeezed her hand, his heart pounding. The council had given them an ultimatum, and now all that was left was to make the choice that would shape the rest of their lives. And as they stood there, hand in hand, Riley knew that no matter what they chose, their bond had already changed him in ways he would never have imagined. The sacred grove was quiet, bathed in the soft light of Valuria's twin suns. The towering trees around Riley and Zyra seemed to hum with life, their glowing leaves casting shimmering patterns on the ground beneath their feet. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to unfold. Riley stood at the center of the grove, the enormity of the moment pressing down on him. The weight of the decision he had made the night before still settled heavily on his chest. He had chosen this path, chosen to undergo the ritual of binding, to forever intertwine his life with Zyra's in a way that defied human understanding. The council's ultimatum had left no room for doubt. This was the only way forward if they wanted to stay together. He glanced at Zyra, who stood just a few steps away, her expression serene yet deeply emotional. Her silver hair cascaded down her back, catching the golden light of the suns, and her dark eyes held a quiet intensity. There was a calm about her that Riley envied, but he knew that she felt the gravity of this decision just as strongly as he did. Their bond had already changed them both, and now it was about to become something permanent, something that couldn't be undone. Zyra took a deep breath, stepping closer to him. She reached for his hand, her touch warm and grounding. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Riley looked into her eyes, searching for any trace of hesitation, but he found none. She had accepted this, just as he had, and that gave him the strength he needed. "I'm ready," he replied, though his heart pounded in his chest. The council members, standing in a circle around the grove, began to chant softly, their voices low and rhythmic. Riley didn't understand the words. They were spoken in an ancient Valuan tongue, but he could feel the meaning behind them. It was a call to the emotional energies that flowed through this world, an invocation of the connection that was about to be sealed. A faint glow began to emanate from the ground around them, swirling in delicate patterns, as if the very earth was responding to the ritual. Riley felt the air grow warmer, the energy in the grove intensifying, wrapping around him and Zyra like a living presence. His heart raced, his skin tingling with anticipation. Zyra stepped even closer, her hand still holding his. "This will bind us, Riley," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but her words carried the weight of the universe. "Our emotions, our thoughts, our lives, they will become one." Riley swallowed hard, nodding. "I know," he whispered back, his voice thick with emotion. "And I want that." Zyra's gaze softened, and for a moment the world around them seemed to fade away. There were no council members, no towering trees, no glowing light, just the two of them, standing on the precipice of something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. The council's chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the light swirling around them intensified. Riley could feel it now, an energy coursing through him, through Zyra, through the air itself. It was as if the bond between them was no longer just emotional, but physical, tangible, pulling them closer together with every breath. Zyra lifted her hand, placing it gently against his chest, right over his heart. Riley mirrored her, pressing his hand to her chest. He could feel her heartbeat beneath his palm, steady and strong, and he wondered if she could feel the rapid pounding of his own. "In this moment," Zyra whispered, her eyes locked on his, "we become one." The light around them flared, brilliant and warm, and Riley felt it, truly felt it. The connection between them, the bond they had been dancing around for so long, came to life. It was a rush of emotion, a flood of warmth and understanding that overwhelmed him, filling every corner of his being. He could feel Zyra's emotions as clearly as his own, the love, the fear, the hope, and he knew she could feel his too. It was more than just sharing feelings. It was as if their very souls had merged, creating something entirely new, something that transcended the boundaries of what Riley had thought possible. There was no longer any separation between them. They were two halves of the same whole, their lives forever intertwined. For a moment, it was too much, too overwhelming, too intense. Riley's breath caught in his throat, his vision blurred as the emotions surged through him. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the intensity ebbed, settling into something deeper, calmer. The light around them faded into a soft glow, and the chanting of the council slowed to a quiet murmur. Riley blinked, his vision clearing, and when he looked at Zyra again, he saw her differently. Not as the Valuan who had been his roommate, not as the alien who had become his companion, but as a part of himself, a part of his soul. The bond between them pulsed softly, a constant presence now, humming in the background of his thoughts and emotions. Zyra's hand tightened around his, and when she spoke, her voice was filled with emotion. "We are bound now," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Forever?" Riley nodded, unable to find the words. He didn't need to. Zyra could feel what he was feeling, just as he could feel her. The bond was stronger than anything he had ever experienced, and in that moment, he knew that he would never be the same. The council stepped forward, their expressions serene but approving. The lead council member, the one who had delivered the ultimatum, spoke softly. "The ritual of binding is complete. You are now one, bound by emotion, thought, and soul. This bond will guide you for the rest of your lives." Riley and Zyra turned to face the council, but the weight of their gaze no longer felt intimidating. They had passed the test, made their choice, and now they stood as equals before the ancient traditions of Valua. As the council members slowly dispersed, leaving the grove in peaceful silence, Riley turned to Zyra, pulling her close. She rested her head against his chest, and they stood there together, wrapped in the quiet of the moment, the warmth of their bond filling the space between them. "Are you scared?" Riley asked softly, his voice trembling slightly. Zyra shook her head, her arms tightening around him. "No, not anymore." Neither of them spoke after that. There was no need. Their bond was complete, and as they stood together, surrounded by the soft glow of the sacred grove, Riley knew that this was his new life, his new home, Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever sacrifices they had made, it had all been worth it, because now they were no longer alone. They were bound forever.